Yeah, exactly.
Okay, we're going to get started. Thank you all for coming. I'm really excited to be here. It's my pleasure and a privilege to introduce Dr. Michael Fotos. He's currently a lecturer of political science, ethics, politics, and economics at Yale University. Very diverse set there of disciplines, and that's great. We embrace that here. He's also associate program director of the graduate program in public policy and a visiting assistant professor at Trinity College. He received an undergraduate degree in economics at Yale University, a master's in public administration from Harvard University, and a PhD in political science from Indiana University, working in the Ostrom's workshop in political theory and policy analysis, and he was Ostrom's student at that time. So I think that a lot of what he'll be talking about today is coming out of some of those work of both Ostroms. He's currently working on a book, which I think sounds really great. I'm looking forward to reading it when it comes out. It's titled Theory and Practice in the Policy Arts, Reflections on the Technology of Self-Government. So that sounds very intriguing, and maybe we can talk about it more about what the content of that book is. And then that's going to, I think, draw on lessons again from the workshop, Options Workshop in Science and Policy Analysis. Without further ado, we're talking about polycentricity today, and as a reminder, you're all invited to attend after the seminar. We'll have a discussion about polycentricity, following the talk. There's some other opportunities to meet with Dr. Fotos afterwards, so let us know and please join us. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, Teresa. It really is a pleasure to be here today, and I want to start out by thanking Teresa for being a great host. Thank you so much for the invitation, and thank you to the Sustainability Solutions Initiative here at the University of Maine and the School of Marine Sciences, and I guess ultimately to Senator Mitchell for all of his work on behalf of this center. I also want to say a special hello to Jim Atchison and Spencer Apollonio. I've used their books in my seminars for a number of years now, and their voices run through my teaching. Those of you who use authors regularly in your courses know how that happens. And it's so nice to be able to talk face to face. I've been teaching political theory for 12 years now. I came to academia in midlife. I was a regulator, an environmental regulator down in West Virginia for several years, worked in politics down there, and then also worked for the Nature Conservancy doing land protection projects in Connecticut and in West Virginia. And that practical experience is really salient to my relationship with the Ostroms and what you do up here, and that is that when you have a theory about how the world works and you take it out and test it and the world doesn't comply with your theory, it's not the world's responsibility to change. What you have to do is you have to take your theory back to the workshop, right? Back to academia and work on it and modify the theory or find another one. And that's the way we understand it. It's that commitment to pragmatism in theory building that is so much a part of what I want to talk about today and the lesson of that. And it's something that Eleanor and Vincent Ostrom at the workshop in political theory and policy analysis, that's what attracted me to that effort, that work in the first place. In a slightly different context, Jim and Ann Atchison make the same point in their 2010 Human Ecology article, which I think is really important to the current situation in fisheries. And that's where they observe that the failure of a fishery after decades of management is not just the failure of the fishery, but also observing the failure of management. And if that failure were confined to, say, one or two fisheries or only one or two areas of policy, of government policy, then we could say it's either bad luck or maybe it's just a really hard problem. But we're seeing policy failures in a proliferation of policy failures in numerous areas: drugs, nutrition, health, education, long list, fiscal balance. And what that's telling us is that the way we teach and practice and theorize policy analysis is broken. And that the way to fix it is to go back to that pragmatic commitment to theory building. We've got to go back and reassess our theories, and that's and that's what I think the workshop has done so well, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. So the first one is that we realize when we look at social theories is that there is no general theory of society or collective action. So the aspiration for generalization is admirable and it's natural, but it's not feasible. And what we have to do instead is understand that our theories are contingent and subject to modification based on experience. And so as understanding improves, our theories get better. We observe, we develop stronger and more precise frameworks for organizing concepts and categorizing observations upon which to build theory. But what we can aspire to are really frameworks that help us organize our observations, that help us organize our concepts, and then we build those observations and concepts into theories. And that's what the IAD framework is about. It's really a way of it's a framework and not a theory. And this is it's really an epistemic commitment to look at it this way. And so much of our problems with theory building in the 20th century, I believe, are these aspirations to grand theories, and the idea that Anglo-American democracy is kind of a universal political organizer, or Marxian economics as a universal political organizer. I mean, these are grand theories, but what we really have in the social sciences is an inductive-deductive process. Observation, return to the laboratory, observation, return to the laboratory. It's an iterative process. So this is a rather common sense result, but it leads to this notion that any principles we deduce are general only to the cases to which they apply. And so we can apply them to cases we've observed, or we can apply them to cases that have attributes that are, for lack of a better word, that are analogous or compatible with the cases we've already observed. And this is a way of saying that we always have to be very careful about what is the nature of the thing that we're observing and what are the attributes we're attributing to that thing. And so this is kind of an unremarkable conclusion when you think about it. It's like, oh yeah, okay. But it raises another question, and that is, what's the nature of observation? Yeah, seeing is believing, right? Seeing is knowing. But observation is so conditioned by the standpoint of the observer. And one of those things is the instrument that we have for observation in the social sciences is a funny thing. It's called language. And so our observations are inseparable from the words we use for describing them. And this is the, language in effect becomes the conveyor belt, in the words of Walter Lippmann, the world outside and pictures in our heads. It's that conveyor belt. And words link ideas to deeds. The words we have available to us influence what we actually see. When we observe nature and they condition the way we convert events in nature into those pictures in our head. And that's that's a counterintuitive property of observation. Seeing is not knowing. Knowing is what enables us to see. So if you expect to see a tragedy of the commons where all the fishers are locked in a race to catch the last fish, you're more likely to see it. If you expect to see the self-organizing capacities of fallible yet adaptive people, then chances are you will see groups of people that have within them potentials for solving the common dilemmas that they face, Let's see if the thing works. It's a little hard to see. So Bruno Latour illustrates the development of scientific ideas and technology by reference to this Janus head of ready-made science and science in the making. This comes from his book, Science in Action, 1987. So ready-made science says once the machine works, people will be convinced. Science in the making says the machine will work when all the relevant people are convinced. And that's this notion of what we believe about nature. And so my challenge as a teacher, when I teach polycentricity, this is a concept that's hard to get your arms around, is to persuade students who are conditioned to see the tragedy as ready-made science, to see the potential of a science of association that's in the making. So, polycentricity is a rather forbidding word. And it's one that nearly all of my students are unfamiliar with before they encounter the Ostroms. So if you look up polycentrism on Wikipedia, you get polycentrism is the principle of organization of a region around several political, social, or financial centers. If you look up polycentric on answers.com, you get having many centers, especially of authority or control. The shift from Soviet American hegemony to a polycentric world. So simply giving students a definition does not make a concept an operational component of research. That's obvious. Students readily grasp the term. It may encompass diverse institutional arrangements, but the associated concepts, centers of authority and systems of control, lead many to visualize the term as applying only to relationships among or between governments. The upshot is that a lot of people use the word polycentricity to refer to, and this includes workshop colleagues occasionally, I catch them, assign a polycentric designation to federal systems organized on unitary or hierarchical principles. Right? So, and that misses the point when the project is a science in the making of promoting environmental self-governance for sustainability. By focusing on government, again, think about how language affects our focus as observers. By focusing on government, we are inclined to overlook the voluntary associations of citizens, or the capacity of citizens to form voluntary or quasi-voluntary associations, as they're known. And it's the inverse of Justice Stewart's famous pronouncement, "I know it when I see it." It's amazing how many undergraduates don't get that reference. That's an old fart joke. So good. So anyway, when it comes to polycentricity, seeing is not necessarily knowing. You see it only if you already know it. So this is where we violate all rules of how to use PowerPoint. We read along on the slides. This is how Eleanor Ostrom defined it in an interview a few years ago. A system where citizens are able to organize not just one, but multiple governing authorities, as well as private arrangements at different scales. Each unit may exercise considerable independence to make and enforce rules within a circumscribed scope of authority for a specified geographical area. In a polycentric system, some units are general purpose governments, where others may be highly specialized, self-organized resource governance systems, and such a system may be special districts, private associations, or parts of local government. These are nested in several levels of general purpose government that also provide civil equity as well as criminal courts. May be special districts, private associations, or parts of local government. Janice's fourth thing. When things are true, they hold. When things hold, they start becoming true. The statement that describes the scholarly struggle, or the struggle in the scholarly community to gain acceptance of the IAD framework. I think Lynn was on the short list for the Nobel for about 12 years before she actually got it. And there was a campaign that had to be organized for the economics profession to recognize the common property resource literature as a valid field of behavioral economics. And so this was the idea that her work and the work of other scholars like Jim Wilson, who were part of, and Jim Atchison here, who were part of that commons property resource management literature, that until the economics profession could recognize it as holding, that's when it started to become true. It's a really interesting. So now, to get a handle on polycentricity from an operational standpoint, you need some additional concepts. This is one of those things where it's part of the framework, and the framework only hangs if you have a group of concepts that you can organize. And the first one, and to me probably the most important, is this notion of public goods thing. And public goods have two attributes that are written about in the Public Goods and Public Choices paper that Lynn and Vincent wrote. Jointness in use and exclusion is difficult. That's a public good. If some quantity of a good is produced, all may use it without diminishing the utility of the good to other consumers, and no one may be easily excluded. Public goods do not provide adequate incentive for private parties to produce them in socially optimal quantity. And so the public goods argument is a customary justification for governments to provide public goods. The private sector simply will not produce them at adequate or at optimal quantity. But public goods in the geophysical and social settings where they occur and where they are consumed are not uniform in scale, in scope, and in many other ways. And as a consequence, the size and the location of the public that would consume them is variable. Moreover, different public goods require different production technologies. And so they gain efficient, that's low subtractability. So they gain efficiency with different financing arrangements or have different properties of subtractability with respect to levels of use or in the presence of competing uses. So this is one, if you read Samuelson and some of the other economics literature, exclusion and subtractability are sometimes conflated, but one of the really important things to consider when we look at it from an institutional analysis perspective is how they're different, and how differentiating them in a field setting is a really useful way to improve your analysis of this particular good in the institutional setting. And that is, under what conditions does subtractability start to occur? And so the example that I use in teaching is, think about a stream. It has public good attributes. And so if it's just rafting, which I used to regulate down in West Virginia, subtractability is low until you get to very high levels of use. Because the rafting companies know how to move lots of people down the river. That's what they make money doing. They manage the crowds, and it kind of is inherent in the way the good is used that subtractability doesn't become an issue until you get to a very high level of use. But think about, say, rafting and fishing. Fishermen like to park in the tailwaters of good rafting rapids, right? So these are incompatible uses. So subtractability becomes an issue at relatively low levels of use. If you've got if you've got yahoos coming through while a guy's in the middle of a back cast, and a number 14 caddis into the backside of a guide is not a happy outcome. And so these factors of scale, serving diverse publics, production, financing, and subtractability give rise to the principle of relative advantage in provision and production arrangements. So, and this is the argument now for polycentricity and institutional diversity. It gets to this notion that certain arrangements have relative advantages, certain organizational arrangements have relative advantages over other organizational arrangements. So scale and scope, financing, provision, which refers usually to collective choice settings, like does the state legislature make the collective choices? Do zoning councils make the collective choices? There are different settings for that. Production technology and conflicting uses. And what this means in practice is that in a healthy, diverse public goods economy, which basically means any society, right? People join together in society in order to provide themselves with the public good of order, safety, security, solving the problem of scarcity, all those problems that society solve together. That in any healthy society, the institutional arrangements are going to be highly diverse. Because a healthy society produces complex packages of goods, both public goods and private goods, and mixed goods. And it produces them at different scales and for different sections of the public. And this is an important thing. We talk about John Dewey. People who've read John Dewey will say the public and its problem. It's more accurately thought of, or more aptly thought of, as the publics and their problems. Right? Because public goods serve different publics. This is where students basically say, okay, I get it in theory, but what does it mean in practice? And the trick is to try to get them to imagine cases they can relate to. So the case of the fishermen and the rafters, that's one that came to me from a student this fall. Who's a kayaker, and she found out I fly fish, and she started complaining about all the fly fishermen who were jerks and hogs, and she was right, and so it's great. This is why you love students who are candid, and so so one of the things in teaching that I stumbled on is the idea of think about a case you know. Think about something you've read about or something you've experienced, and write about it in the way that Dr. Atchison would or Professor Osterwood, because they're reading Capturing the Commons, they're reading Governing the Commons, and so then they say, oh, wow, what would he say, or what would she say? And it's really fun, because this year I had them watch the Nobel lecture, and their job was to pretend you're in the audience and you get to ask the first question. What's your question? And this is after they've read a selection of Lynn's work. You know, how would she answer it? And my favorite one was the student who wrote, Brendan, that's an excellent question. So, you know, this should look familiar. That we've got, you know, the SES framework. This is a way of abstractly representing polycentrism in action, polycentricity in action. But how do you make a concrete image of this? Right? How do you carry a concrete image of this? Because right when we can operationalize a concept, we have a concrete image of it in our minds. So Garrett Hardin gave us the tragedy of the commons. You know, anybody who's ever flipped through National Geographic and seen a picture of a herder in the Maghreb or one of the Mongolian nomads, you know, can imagine, you know, one cow, another cow, and another cow until the last blade of grass is gone. You know, that's the inexorable tragedy. But, you know, we have the problem of, when we teach polycentricity, we have the problem of helping students to visualize resource systems, resource services, I know this is a little hard to read, governance systems, and actors, and local action situations, interactions and outcomes. Now, how do you visualize that? I mean, fortunately, we've got lobster gangs, right? You're cutting gear, or, you know, shatter bottom, and keepers, shorts, oversized, and you know that this is one that, have you ever seen Lobster Bob, the video Lobster Bob? Oh, it's great. It's down at the aquarium in Booth Bay. This is my introduction to lobster fishing. Lobster Bob has you know, footage of guys on deck with their gauge, throwing the gauge on the back of a bug, you know, and then of course there's the lobster who looks, he knows it's a keeper, and it goes right in, right? So this is right, okay, eyeliners and renegades and of course thumbnail. You know, if you can, you know, if you bring this system in, and of course, you know, here we are, Gulf of Maine, a constrained ecosystem, and of course, what? The Atlantic States Council, the National Marine Fisheries Service. So if you can help students kind of relate these to things they know, it makes a difference. But that's not easy, because what are we in right now? We're in the silly season of the constitutional lottery known as the presidential, right? And you know, and students and we're exposed to this 24/7 saturation about the one. You know, the one who will create jobs, the one who will assure fairness, the one who will get the economy moving again, the one who will keep us safe. And if we were undecided voters in a swing state, that one would keep the crabgrass out of our yards and the cellulite off our thighs. And you know, that's called the cult of personality. And when it's not a presidential campaign, we have the Federal Reserve Chairman whose very utterances are going to assure global prosperity. We have celebrity general who single-handedly fixed Iraq. We have, we have terrorist supermen who have to be confined to a remote island fortress, restrained by manacles made of pure kryptonite. Well, I exaggerated the part about the island fortress. It's actually a fortress on the end of an island. And, this is the cult of personality, and students are conditioned not to recognize social order in the absence of a central manager. It's the idea that we cannot discover social order unless we have a recognizable central manager. And polycentricity is not that. Polycentricity is all about that invisible hand of social order that comes from healthy relationships between associations of citizens. Another thing that is in the zeitgeist that we cannot control is our students swim in a sea of named national policies. We have, and each one is overseen by its own czar. And czar, by the way, comes from Kaiser, which meant divinely appointed supreme leader. And healthcare, education, welfare, homeland security, drug policy, immigration policy, environmental policy, and so on condition students and citizens to accept without blinking the intimation that a policy vacuum exists unless it's the subject of a named national policy. Remember what I said about this notion that people misconstrue hierarchical, unitary systems organized on federal principles as polycentricity. See how that happens? And finally, the policy analytic literature that we assign routinely presumes that the point of analysis is to recommend action by the government. In capital letters, the government, scare quotes, for intervening to direct the affairs of society in some ameliorative fashion. We train our students to construct the client as a beneficent, rational public official who, if given the insight of our analysis, will achieve omniscience and do the right thing. And our vocabulary of organizational pathology is limited to two primary concepts: lack of political will, and a public that is too dense to listen closely when the experts speak. The consequences of practice of policy analysis, it promotes a mental image of society as something that can be beneficially controlled by central direction, and that is populated by citizens who are spectators to their own salvation or their own undoing. I'm swimming against the tide when it comes to persuading political science and public policy majors that they're practicing bad medicine or that they're preparing to practice bad medicine. With environmental scientists, things are a little different. It's actually kind of nice, because by training in disposition, environmental scientists have mental images of functional ecosystems. This is the mental image thinking. That polycentric, self-governing systems have an analog in nature, and it's an ecosystem. And it's one that environmental scientists understand. None of us are immune to the zeitgeist, but when you have access to alternative concepts, it expands your range of observational capacity. So my objective with conventional, students who've had a conventional political science training is subversion. Disciplinary subversion. The democracy and sustainability syllabus, which Teresa, I think, distributed or posted, lists one conventional political science title, and it's by a guy who's known as a contrarian. It has 2 marine ecologists and a commercial fisherman who have contributed 3 titles. An anthropologist contributes 1, and the final one is Eleanor Ostrom, who is sui generis. And, you know, students eventually figure out that this is something different. And they figure out the workshop formula, the idea of things like face-to-face, recognition of rights to organize, non-problematic boundary conditions, local reserves of leadership, access to low-cost mechanisms for conflict resolution, and so on. And then they say, Professor, I get it, but I'm really concerned about climate change or global fisheries. The small-scale stuff doesn't do it. How does it scale up? And so the first thing I do is what every good professor does is I dodge the question. And I ask them if perhaps they have the burden of proof reversed. The failures of global climate policy and fisheries management suggest that the authors of conventional approaches bear some responsibility for those problems. And that they should demonstrate that their policies will scale down. If the status of a problem depends on the actions of innumerable people going about their daily affairs, then we have a problem dynamic that depends on the resolution of millions or perhaps billions of individual small-scale face-to-face interactions. So the question to ask then is, on what grounds can we expect monocentric or centralized solutions to adequately address a billion little things? How will central managers acquire sufficient knowledge and authority to order the affairs of billions of people? And if you believe they can, then you can make some pretty strong assumptions, right? You can assume, for example, that the Central Committee of the Communist Party of China can order the reproductive affairs of 1.3 billion people. Right? Or you can assume, maybe, that a panel of 15 experts can beneficially arrange for the health care of 300 million Americans. These are the operating assumptions. So we don't have data on the implementation of the Affordable Care Act, but we do have actually 20 years of peer-reviewed research on the one-child policy. And so this is why I use it as a teaching case. Political authority, political will, and science united. Right? That's what the rational decision makers of the Central Committee have. And here are the findings in summary. The science behind the policy is a sham. The demonstrable effects of the policy in reduced fertility are much smaller than official claims. And the human and social costs are extensive. And all policies have the attributes of a political experiment, and costly experiments with dubious effect impose a high cost on the respect and legitimacy that people are willing to accord their governments. So this is where we introduce obvious facts that are wrong. For millennia, people woke up in the morning. Where are these? Which way are these? These is that way, okay? So for millennia, people woke up. Sun comes up. Sun goes overhead. Sun goes down. Right? Next morning, sun comes up. Goes overhead, goes down. Right? It's an obvious fact, right? Sun's going around the Earth. You can make calendars based on it. You can set your sundial on it. You know, 50 years before Copernicus, Christopher Columbus followed the sun on its daily orbit and discovered a new world. And then when Copernicus published his paper, he didn't have the data right. And his math really didn't add up. And no one believed him, or not very many people believed him, until about 150 years later when Newton published Principia Mathematica. But assuming that one can explain the entire range of feasible organizational arrangements for a thinking species with 7 billion members, speaking thousands of languages, by resort to a dichotomous classification of institutions, that's a heroic assumption, isn't it? To assume that the only legitimate form of constitutional government involves parliaments and bureaucracies organized on unitary principles, and that the only way to aggregate public opinion and the only way to find out what people want, what the public good is through public opinion and voting. You know, I don't have time to delve into the empirical basis for rejecting those assumptions, but you know, I can say that 2005, Understanding Institutional Diversity accounts for this one. Monocentric versus polycentric reasoning. And finally, this one hides a deeper process of contestation, inquiry, and deliberation that go into human decision making. So, you know, the attempt by outsiders to organize Afghan society according to markets and states, parliaments and bureaucracy, voting and public opinion has proven to be a tragic mistake, and it's one of many. The belief that we can reorganize society by simple classifications is an illusion of power that serves the powerful at the expense of the powerless. This is another reason why we teach polycentricity, is there is a value commitment here to human dignity. That these simple concepts are concepts that serve the powerful at the expense of the powerless. And they're based, the simplification of society is based on certain pathologies of knowledge, fundamental epistemological errors. The first one is what Vincent Ostrom calls the fantasy of omnicompetence. And it's something that we project onto the vessels of our hope. This is an illness of the people. And Barbara Allen has noted that we err in our policy analytics when we overestimate the rationality of a bureaucracy and underestimate the rationality of bureaucrats. All right? The second one is the delusion of omniscience. This is an illness of the government. And so a man or a small group of them may persuade themselves that they can transform the political culture of a civilization by some simple political expedient. Whether it was Mao in the Great Leap Forward or George Bush in Iraq, the results are tragedy. There's a deeper lesson here. It's one that Charles Lindblom wrote about in two really great articles, which I recommend. They both appeared in PAR, Public Administration Review, 1959, 1979, about incremental analysis. And that is, when we base our analytics on impossible assumptions, we're setting ourselves up for failure. And, you know, I can't resist, because the Royal Newfoundland Regiment, you know, what do they have to do with fisheries and sustainable management? Well, we should never forget that powerful people can employ avoidance strategies more powerfully than anybody else. And one of those avoidance strategies is the belief that you can simplify the world because you're in a position of power. So generals in World War I believed they could arrange war by targets and timetables, with common but differentiated responsibilities. The red tabs, as the generals were known, they stayed in chateaus, and the green tabs, they lived in the mud. Common but differentiated responsibilities. They both wanted to defeat the Germans. So, on July 1, 1916, the Royal Newfoundland Regiment set out for its target, Beaumont Hamel, at the appointed time of 0915 hours. And here they are on St. John's Road, minutes before they set out. The unit that was supposed to go with them was behind schedule, but their commander said, I'm going to stay on my timetable. And they marched out. And the next morning, there were 780 men went over the top, and the next morning, 68 answered the roll. This was the first day of the Battle of the Somme. 70 years later, Newfoundlanders, or Newfies, answered to national fisheries scientists who believed they could manage cod stocks along the same industrial principles. And they experienced yet another tragedy. So humans are fallible and adaptive creatures, but it's one thing to keep in mind that simplified processes may be well suited to producing public goods that are uniform in scale and scope, but they are poorly suited to produce the complex packages of public and private goods that a society needs to sustain itself and to remain just. So fish management, by a single number, has certainly simplified marine ecosystems and simplified the task of management for the national government. But the process of simplification comes with a cost. And one of the things we know is that healthy ecosystems produce complex packages of public goods. And our best hope for matching governance of those ecosystems to the ecosystems themselves in a sustainable way comes through a commitment to polycentrism in our designs of policy. And this is where Vincent Ostrom really influenced my work. And I'm going to drop a couple of pages here because I'm looking at the clock. But those general principles always apply. Power with, not power over. Respect for the diversity of patterns of association. Public service entrepreneurs. This is where men like Horatio Creed, the double gauge and the import ban, transformed the lobstering situation to one where it was possible for the conservation ethic to emerge. Knowledge of at least two communities. The natural community goes without saying in the School of Marine Science, but the social community too. That if you can't bring the two together in some way, you cannot hope to sustainably manage the resource without engaging the community that lives in the resource. And I was really fortunate you're fortunate to be here in Maine because, to be frank with you, the work that you're doing here is way ahead of work that I've seen elsewhere on this problem. And I really want to praise Professor Wilson and Professor Atchison for their work, because my teaching is much improved as a result of it. But I did have an opportunity when I was younger and did not yet have the language to see what I was seeing, to observe polycentrism in action in the hills of West Virginia. And since I'm at the home of Maine bears, I got to tell a bear story. And there's a guy by the name of Joe Riefenberger, who for 28 years was the state bear biologist. And that's Chris Ryan, who's now the state bear biologist down in West Virginia. And in the 1960s, bear population in West Virginia had dwindled to fewer than 500 animals. And they were going down. And there was really, people were talking seriously about the extirpation of the species within the state. And they hired a young guy by the name of Joe Riefenberger, who had just graduated, I think, from Penn State, to come down and see what he could do. And at the time, bear season was always 2 weeks before deer season, because they didn't want two groups of hunters, each with lots of heavy heat in their hands, in the woods at the same time. So the deer rifle hunters had to be out there by themselves, and the bear hunters had to be out there by themselves. But bear numbers kept going down, and so Joe was a young biologist who had two great toys, and they were brand new at the time. The tranquilizer dart and the radio collar. And Joe and his team ran around and they collared every bear they could find, and they also collected as much information as they could from every bear hunter they could talk to. So every bear that got killed, they would be on the scene and they would go collect as much information as they could about sex and reproductive history and all that as they could figure out. And in the process, Joe got to know the bear hunters. And they were concerned too about the dwindling numbers of bears and the dwindling numbers of places to hunt bears. And in West Virginia, the highliners of mountain bear hunting are the dog men, guys who hunt bears with dogs. It's an expensive sport. So these are men of substance, and they also have political influence. And in the course of his research, Joe discovered many funny things about bear biology, and with Joe it was always funny. But, it's the kind of thing that only young guys with new toys, lots of enthusiasm, chasing dangerous game can have. And so, on several occasions, Joe noticed that when you dart a bear near a den, it will run into the den before collapsing. And on other occasions, he observed that often more than one bear uses the same den. But on this particular occasion, Joe observed that when the biologist goes into the den to retrieve the darted bear, and the other bears in the den wake up, they wake up feeling very cross. And that's when Joe made another discovery, and that is that a young biologist can shimmy backwards out of a hole much faster than he shimmied in. And that's when his three colleagues stand there mystified by why Joe has suddenly disappeared over the hill so quickly. And then they find out when the bear pops its head out of the hole. And of course they quickly join Joe running over the hill. But there was also the discovery of the double gauge moment in West Virginia bear history. And that is when the winter of the year rolls around, pregnant sows go to bed first. They go into the den first, and so they're out of the woods. So when the old boars and the teenagers, they hang around in the woods as long as there's food available. So when you shoot a bear in October, chances are you're shooting 3. Mama and 2 fetal cubs. At least half the time anyway. But if you shoot a bear in December, it's either an unattached teenager or an old boar. And that old boar has already done all he can for next year's crop of cubs. So you're killing 1 bear, not 3. And so this is where the polycentrism came in. Joe started talking to the bear hunters. And what he found was that when he proposed this idea of having a dog season with no kill, where they could go out in the woods and train their dogs for a month without killing any bears, and then have a trophy season in December after deer season where they could hunt trophy boars with their dogs, that's a good deal. And so when a mama bear gets run around by a pack of dogs, when she gets tired, she goes up a tree or goes in a hole. And as long as the dog men come and grab the dogs, it's just a little bit of prenatal aerobic exercise. And so this is something where Joe, using that combination of charm and knowledge of the communities, both communities, he persuaded the director of the DNR, the Conservation Commission, and the legislature, because the bear is the state animal, to change the bear season. And now West Virginia has over 10,000 bears. There are so many bears now that hunting is nearly statewide instead of just confined to a few counties. And in addition to that, you can kill bears now in the early season and in the late season, and the numbers are not affected because the population is so strong. So there's more bear hunting, more opportunities to bear hunt, and more bears. And that's what conservation success looks like, and it looks very polycentric. So I thank you for the chance to be here today, and I'm looking forward to our afternoon session for any questions. I'm sorry I used up all my time now, but thank you very much.